Okay. Sandra?
Yes, so I'm seeing that attendees are joining, so I'm gonna give just a couple of more seconds before starting.
So we can hear you, that's good.
Yes.
Texas calling. Do we have any problem, Houston?
I think we're okay down here.
Great.
It's not Houston.
We're close.
Good. So the numbers are increasing. That's good to see.
Yes.
You shouldn't use the academic quota, as we say in German, but a few minutes is, I think, is okay.
I can maybe already start with a brief introduction
Okay.
while our attendees are joining so that we are on track with the time. So first of all, hello to everyone and welcome to the first webinar of the CoR Digital Masterclasses. Today we will talk about the crisis communication. My name is Sandra Mitrovic. I'm a social media officer at the European Committee of the Regions. And today I will guide you through some housekeeping rules so that we all make the most out of this webinar. And I will also explain very briefly what the Digital Masterclass program is all about and how CoR members can benefit from it. After this presentation, very brief presentation, I will give the floor to Achim Landwig, who is the head of Digital and Social Media Publications Unit at the CoR. He will be our moderator for today and will lead the discussions with our main speaker and guest, Professor Coombs. So without further ado, I will kick off with a very short presentation of the Digital Masterclass program. So first of all, this program was launched early this year, launched by the social media team. And its main objective is to equip CoR members, alternates, and their staff with digital skills to connect with citizens and voters online. So the program, as I believe you can see from the slides, is structured around three main activities. First of which are the expert talks, such as the one we're actually having today, where we invite leading experts, both in the digital world or in academia or from social media platforms themselves, to give an interesting presentation to our members. The second activities that we organize are practical sessions. So this is where we look a bit more into detail of certain aspects of social media and digital communications to help our members communicate better online. And the third activity that is part of the digital masterclasses are the one-on-one coaching sessions. So this is where you as a CoR member, alternate, or your staff could contact a social media expert to get personalized advice on how to better reach followers online or on social media. So how can you participate in the digital masterclasses? So you can find more information about the whole program on the links below that you can see on the slides. And my colleagues will also share the links in the chat. Or you can also contact the social media team at the email address of socialmedia@cor.europa.eu. So this is very briefly about the digital masterclasses. I will turn my focus to today and explain a little bit about housekeeping rules for this webinar. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the recording via email afterwards, together with a brief document summarizing the key takeaways of today's webinar. Attendees are muted, so your microphones and your cameras are switched off. That doesn't mean that we don't want you to interact with us, so we actually invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar. You may do so using the Q&A function or the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to use it throughout the whole webinar. Our speaker and our moderator will also glance through your questions and try to answer them throughout the webinar, but we will also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So after the Q&A session, please also bear with us just a little bit more, because we are curious to hear your feedback. So we will also run the evaluation polls, asking you just a couple of questions that can give us more information of how we did this webinar. Also, what I want to mention that here with us today, from the social media team, you see just me now, but actually behind the scenes, we have the whole team working with us. Claudia, Catherine, Betty are all here behind the scenes, as well as our contractors, Valentina and Sorina. So without further ado, I give the floor now to Achim, who will do a few opening remarks and also introduce our main speaker, Professor Coombs.
Thank you very indeed to Sandra, but also to Katrin, Claudia, and Betty for all this very innovative approach. This digital masterclass is one of the many different things we are trying and experimenting with in terms of social media here at the Committee of the Region. We are really striving for some innovative approaches. And COVID, as sad as it is, has also further challenged us now to do our first webinar. We had already a digital masterclass live with people on the premises, but now we go further digital. And I will limit myself now to introduce Professor Coombs. The challenge is that his CV is some 30 pages long. I'm not going to read it out, but rest assured, he's a very distinguished professor with a very, very long experience on crisis communication. He's currently at the Texas University, Department of Communication, but he has a number of outstanding awards. He has been at different university departments. He's also chairing a couple of relevant editorial boards, doing a number of presentations, got a number of fellowships, etc., etc. We will post a link to his department website so that you can read for yourself. And I will really limit it to myself to this, because the floor is really yours, Professor Coombs. We would like to listen to you, and maybe we could start by your giving us a little bit of an introduction into what is really crisis communication and why is it relevant? It sounds like a stupid question, but I'm sure there is more behind.
Yes, it's actually a very good question, because probably prior to COVID-19, a lot of people were saying, oh, do we really need that crisis stuff at all? And as you can see, yes, you really do need it. You never are quite sure when it's going to come out. And one of the kind of defining characteristics of a crisis is you have this disruption to your operations. And we're all feeling that now, no matter what type of organization we're in. I mean, that's kind of the effect of this pandemic. And what that does is it kind of creates issues among your constituency, because they have certain expectations that there will not be disruptions, particularly in services being provided by government. And while people understand, yeah, there's a crisis and things are going to be interrupted for a while, eventually that sympathy is limited, and they expect you to restore services or to help address their concerns in some way. So while you're giving a little bit of sort of a grace period at the start, you soon have to deliver, and you deliver through crisis management. And crisis management is really driven through crisis communication. It's through communication. Those are your words and your actions of what you're doing about the crisis situation. And public health creates this sort of very unique problem for you because there are health consequences for the entire community. So everyone's at risk. Some groups will be at more risk than others, but your whole community can suffer from this. And that's very unique in a crisis setting that you have delivered by this public health. The other thing that's unique in this situation is it's fast. It's moving fast, but also it moves slowly, because while it can spread fast, the effects can last for a very long period of time. As we see, it's not a matter of a few hours, a few days, a few weeks. Now we're talking more than weeks and into months that we have to cope with this. And the big risk is if it moves too quickly, it can overwhelm the capacity of the community to respond in a health crisis. And that's when we started talking about distancing, to try and slow it down so that the system has an ability to cope with it. And as we talk about the process of crisis management, as you can see on the slide, there are really three interrelated phases. It begins in the pre-crisis phase, and that's where you engage in mitigation, those are your efforts to try and reduce risk in some way. So mitigation is used because you don't want to tell people, oh, we're going to prevent risk, because risk is always there. Life is risk. You get up in the morning and you get out of bed, you immediately have some risks. But what are you doing to mitigate it, try and reduce that? You try and build resilience, and that's through your programs pre-crisis, where you try and educate people about ways that they can better learn to cope with situations. We do that a lot in terms of emergency planning related to natural disasters, but it can relate to any type of crisis, to try and build that resilience through teaching people things they can do in the future. And we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. And then there's your preparation. Do you have a crisis plan? Do you have a crisis team? And what you find is, whether you're on the government side or on the corporate side, most people do have plans and teams, but not all will. And you kind of probably see that change as a result of this as well. Then after you have your preparation, your pre-crisis, then you have to respond when a crisis occurs. And we're in the crisis response now. And as I said, it's what you say and what you do when the crisis emerges. Your actions are your words too. So all this is crisis communication. And that's why I say that crisis communication really sort of is the lifeblood of the crisis management process. And it not only includes the actions that you're taking, but what are the actions the community needs to take? And this is a theme I want to address kind of throughout the discussion, is that you are asking the community to do certain things. And that becomes very important, because in part, that's going to give them a sense of control. They feel they can do something about it. But it's also incumbent upon you to make sure you're telling them the right things to do and help them through that process. And that's where communication becomes critical throughout this. And then you move into the post-crisis phase. And sometimes it's hard to tell when you move from crisis to post-crisis. But in post-crisis, you're actually learning from the crisis. What did we do well? What did we do that didn't work so well? How can we improve it next time? And that's something, once the situation calms down, you're going to need to think about and see, all right, what adjustments need to be made? How can we do work better in the future? And not that you'll necessarily have another pandemic soon, but you're going to have other crises, and you can learn general lessons even from this situation. And as you're recovering from the crises, you're going to need to restart operations. How is that going to occur? And that's probably not going to be all at once. You just don't open the floodgates up, but it's probably going to be in a staged approach. What will that look like? And how will you lead people through that process? And those are important concerns. And because you can see how the post-crisis then leads back to the pre-crisis. I've learned lessons, and I can improve my pre-crisis. If I'm better prepared, I can better respond. And so that's what crisis is about. It's about thinking ahead and being prepared, so that when the situation comes, it's not that you have a list of exactly what you should do, but you've thought about the actions you need to take. You've thought about who's going to be responsible for those actions, so you can better respond in those crisis situations. And that's kind of a rough introduction and a very quick class on crisis and crisis communication and crisis management.
Thanks, Professor Coombs, for framing this. We will go now more into detail, but maybe permit me just to complement one bit. I think it's really vital, and I speak also from experience, the day the crisis is over, not to forget what we have learned and what we have missed. It goes so quickly that we return to normality, and then when the next crisis comes, we stand there again, possibly with empty hands. Our crisis plans are not updated, etc. So while we are in the midst of the COVID crisis, I think it's a very, very helpful reminder to all of ourselves. It's starting to begin the right moment in time to already think about preparing the post-crisis lessons. Now, this leads me to a further question. Of course, everybody defines crisis differently, and let's not go too much into semantics on that. But maybe you could help us a little bit to better understand how you see how COVID crisis differs from other major crises. And I think what springs to mind here is probably the 2008 financial crisis, which was also a worldwide crisis. But maybe you have other examples you can compare to.
Yeah, the COVID-19 is challenging because it's so broad in terms of the range of organizations and people it's affecting. And we didn't see, I mean, the financial crisis is probably the closest thing we have to that. And you're really going back pretty far in time, probably to the Spanish flu, to see situations that are so widespread. Because in the past decade, we have had some bad flu seasons that were technically pandemics, but not the threat we're seeing now. And that's the idea of kind of bringing in this notion of whether you want to call it social distancing or physical distancing. You know, the World Health Organization is kind of changing. It's thinking, yeah, maybe it's better physical because people aren't understanding social distancing also means physical distancing. And one of the oddities is this is a situation where this is a crisis that's thrust upon you. Oftentimes you have a crisis that's sometimes of your own making, but particularly in government, you usually are coming in to crises that you didn't cause. Natural disasters are a good example of that, but you're still accountable for it. And that's what becomes critical here, that you're going to be accountable for it and you're going to be judged for your actions in the end. That, you know, your constituents who are out there are going to look to see how you're handling this situation, and that's going to impact their trust and how they relate to you and your agencies in the future. So it's important to actually do that well. And particularly with COVID-19, what we see is the threat is so pervasive. That's one of your concerns in crisis communications. You need to, people have to take this risk seriously. Well, there were a few places, and unfortunately the US was one of them. Many of our officials didn't take it seriously at first, others did. The ones who were there to take it seriously first, in our case, their states are in much better shape than other ones who didn't take it seriously. And then one of the things you really need to emphasize during this process is efficacy. How the plans you're telling people, the actions they should take, how those will work. And that's been really important to do throughout this process. And I think that's been one of the challenges that have been met by many crisis communicators, is to really get that out there and say, yes, social distancing, washing your hands, this will work. This is something you can do and something that will help you get some control over your life. And that efficacy, that ability that this will work and that you can do it, becomes critical in those situations. And I think that's kind of what makes this unique, is that we really can bring the community into this. The community is a part of this response. And our response can only go as well as the community is willing to help and to be a part of that response. But we also keep in mind, and this is something I'll talk about later, is that anxiety is a critical feature in all of this. And we have to be mindful of the anxiety that we're feeling, not only for ourselves, but what members of the communities are seeing. And on this slide, it highlights some of the points that we'll touch on later in the conversation about the idea of showing concern and simple messages. But particularly, you need to think about your communication as what's called psychological first aid. You want to actually be part of that. Is not just instructing, telling people what to do, but comforting messages. And also getting across in the actions you're taking to help to reduce their anxiety. But these are points I think we'll elaborate on as we go further with the discussion.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important point now, to go to some probably practical examples and to learn a little bit from your experience. And maybe just as an adjunct, I mean, you mentioned the word community, which is a more the American term. We would refer to local and regional politicians, but basically we mean the same. We don't speak about a nationwide address. We don't speak about a global address. but a very tailored, specific, local, community, regional outreach. I think that's important to start. Maybe you could help us a little bit with your experience, how local and regional politicians can very practically, with accuracy and authority, provide good, relevant, safe information, particularly in a situation where things change so quickly. I was just wondering whether there are any practical hints. I don't know whether storytelling helps, whether any communication channels are preferred. What's your experience? What can you share with us?
Yeah, I think that's good that you brought up the local nature of this, because really in the end, the response is local. And that's really what it is. I mean, we think about what's going on in our city and in our region. It really is a local aspect, because you can talk about larger numbers, but the local is what really matters. Well, I'll start by kind of talking about just the idea of how anxiety impacts communication, and then kind of bring that into some guidance for managers to think about. And you know, as we're in this situation and it's unfolding and it changes every day, updating regularly becomes critical. And that's where you want to turn to, sort of, as you want to be the source of information that people turn to locally, that they look for that. And you want to update them regularly on actions being taken to protect people, or have there been changes to that? I know ours locally, we started with sort of one situation that was voluntary, that moved to kind of more mandatory, and then sort of bringing in breathing masks. People need to know that. How are things changing? And what does that mean for their behaviors? It's also good to talk about the evidence that it's working. People need some positive reinforcement during this time. And we talk about a lot about flattening the curve, but what does that mean for people? Well, that means that more people will now live as a result of the actions we're taking on our own. And if you can, I think storytelling is a good idea. And the best way to do storytelling is to not just talk about numbers, but to talk about the people behind those numbers. You know, this is if people are willing to agree to it, but talk about a specific individual who has recovered, who has benefited as a result of that, and have them tell their stories. That becomes very powerful to what you're doing there. And that's part of this nature, kind of showing the human side to what's going on, because you want to make sure that you don't forget along the way to express concern and to show compassion for the people who are affected. Let them know that you understand this is a difficult time for them, and that what you're asking for, while easy on one face, can also be taxing on another, to kind of recognize those concerns. It's also important that we provide ways to get additional information, that you want to keep your messages short, because when people are anxious, just, you know, we'll get to that in just a bit, their comprehension is reduced. So you can get out short message, particularly digital platforms are excellent for that. But keep in mind, not everyone is digital, not everyone is online. So how can you provide additional information, both digitally, which is very easy. You can send links to have people go in to say a centralized website. That's kind of this idea of a bike design with a hub and spokes coming off of it. But what are some other non-digital options? Who can they call? Who can they talk to when they have concerns? So you want to keep that in mind, because digital is great and has a lot of advantages, but has limits to do. And here's just some guidance for managers to think about as they're kind of going through this process. And the first thing is, when you're developing a message, ask yourself, how does this information help people? I think one of the mistakes we see, not locally, but more sort of on the state and the federal level in the US, is politicians use these messages to talk about other things. Well, that's not what's going on. And on the local level, we're not seeing that. On the local level, the mayors, the town leaders understand this is what people need. I need to help them in some way. So how will this information help them? There's this formula in risk communication, it's numbers, that your message should be short, only 27 words, 9 seconds, and only 3 ideas. So keep it simple. And that's the notion that in situations that produce anxiety, your comprehension level just drops. That's because you're processing other information, and there's a lot of technical aspects to that, but just know keeping it simple. And this is an idea known as message mapping, to try it. So think simply. And think about how to reach unique groups. What are the messages for children? How can you help parents for them to talk about COVID-19 with their kids and why they're going through the situation? I have a great nephew. He's only 7, and he's being isolated. In part, he's diabetic, so he's a high risk group. And I've been talking to his mother about how to talk to him about that. Put that in perspective. Do you have unique language communities? If you do, it's good to work with the leaders in those communities and have some of your message go through those leaders. And that's good for both the digital and the non-digital space as well. And for those non-digital communities, locally, cities are employing some interesting ideas. Some local communities are writing letters to everyone and having them delivered to everyone in the community. Others are pre-recording phone messages and having those short phone messages sent to everyone in the community. And that's the way to reach the non-digital aspect, and not relying upon either local television or local newspaper, which will be there to help, but to reach them directly. Letters and phone calls, very old technology, but still very useful in reaching and getting people out there. And all that kind of leads to the bottom point, and that is you want to build a sense of control for people. They need to feel that you're giving them information that's really helpful, that they can take these steps and they can make themselves safer and their families safer. And that's a big concern, because a lot of times people say, well, I'm not worried about myself, but they're concerned about their families. So how will this impact the families? We saw that, among the younger generation saying, oh, I'm not worried about this. Like, well, what about your parents? What about your grandparents? Your behaviors can affect them. So this is something where we're all a part of it, and kind of giving that sense of control, because that sense of control also gives people a sense of hope as well. And so I think this is kind of a nice summary of some of the messages when you're talking in the area of COVID-19, the points you really need to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you very much. These are a number of rich ideas. I think I'm not attempting to summarize them, but maybe would it be fair to say that the only limit is our fantasy, kind of. Every measure can be kind of helpful.
Yes, yeah, I think this is a time to really think about using all your channels, all your messages, all your options to really get your messages out there for people.
Maybe just to add one example here where I live currently, the fire brigade is driving around with loudspeakers and playing songs. Some people thought this is stupid, but actually they got a super good response, because this cheers up the mood. Elderly people who can't get out get into tears because they hear these songs, and it sounds very unconventional, but it seems to provide some comfort.
Yes, and in the US, some local schools are doing parades where they have their teachers drive by and the students come out and wave and say hello. And it's a way just to kind of keep in touch with that. And yeah, these are small things that people can dismiss, but in a world where there's a lot of anxiety, something different, unusual like that can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can I just probe into one little thing, if I just got it right, and maybe it's helpful for others. Did you say that you refer to Washington, the big national politics, that people will sense if politicians misuse local communication for a bigger agenda?
Yes, I think people are very sort of resentful when they see politicians trying to use this as a chance to advance their careers, because this is a time to think about your local people, not about where you're going to be or an upcoming election.
Right, okay. I think these are challenges which are similar on both sides of the Atlantic. Maybe we can turn to another type of question. Again, very specifically to communities, local and regional leaders. I mean, disinformation is a big thing today. It's actually really a big thing, but it's also a little bit of a buzzword. Maybe you could shed a little bit light on that with some concrete examples, how local and regional politicians can best deal with this information during such a time of crisis. I know we could have probably 5 different webinars on this, but maybe just a little bit of gist or an appetizer.
Yes, this is something to take seriously. This disinformation and sometimes conspiracies that appear online, you really need to take a stand and try and correct that, because it can undermine your efforts. And this is where you can you can reach out to the people in the community. I'll give you two examples in the United States. One is that there was this belief among the African-American community that they won't get COVID-19. That's a white disease. And that's not the case. They are disproportionately being hit and hit very hard. And so Magic Johnson, the very famous international basketball player, has stepped forward and tried to be a source for that. He was also a voice decades ago in the AIDS situation, and he's trying to come forward to help correct that. And you can tie in your local messaging with something like that that's going on, an influencer who's coming forward and trying to help you in some way. And also, what they found in locally is that a lot of the younger people were violating a lot of the rules. And so what they did is they specifically, the towns created messages on TikTok, this video social media platform. It's mostly about song and dancing, to get across the message that, no, this can hurt you and you need to be part of the solution. So there are ways local politicians are trying to get at that disinformation by identifying this is bad information and getting others to support that, and if you can leverage influencers, that's great, because you're going to reach more people and that will help you in your messages.
Also interesting that you mentioned TikTok, which many people would probably think it's not my platform, it's more for the kids to play with. Mm-hmm. But maybe this is also an interesting food for thought, that we should think out of the box to use other platforms and maybe to reach out. If I understand you correctly, you talk about influencer. I could imagine that people, particularly as a politician, I might be a little bit tempted to be careful to reach out on an influencer, depending on.
Yeah, there would have to be a trusted source. It's someone who's really on board and that you know will be a part of it. You would have to have some discussions ahead of time and then vet the messages as they're going out. So yeah, that's always the risk with influencers. You have to make sure that they're trusted and really going to be a part of your team and not work against you.
Is there anything, I think there is this American concept of, as a US concept of surrogates. Is there anything maybe which would be helpful for us to learn from in this respect?
The which one?
The surrogates. I mean, if you have somebody.
Yes, I think that's kind of going back. If you know you can identify specific leaders in the community who would help you reach specific populations too, like if you have what might have been historically considered marginalized groups, to bring their leadership in and have them speak as well, that's a great form of endorsement. It can really find ways to kind of amplify your message. But again, that needs to be coming out of a set of meetings where everyone kind of understands and knows what's going on and how you're being a part of trying to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Before I turn to the next question, just speaking under Sandra's control, participants can feel free to submit their questions in the chat, and we will also have time to answer questions. Don't forget about that. Maybe I can turn to social media specifically. We touched already upon a little bit, but in your view, be honest. I know that you are watched by 4 social media professionals, but what is your personal view? Is social media rather a blessing or a curse during such a crisis?
Well, it's both. It's both a blessing and a curse. And I see it more in crisis communication, more on the blessing side, because it provides more ways to reach people. And in a crisis, the more ways you have to reach people, the better, because you're likely to hit more people, and repetition is great and the costs are actually lower. But the speed is good on both sides. You can update like never before and delivering information directly. I mean, we just didn't have that capacity, 15, 20 years ago. Now that's wonderful, but this information also moves at the same speed. So you have that balancing out. You also have the fact that social media does seem more personal. Not that it necessarily is, but people feel that way. It's, oh, you tweeted to me. That's great. Well, yeah, you tweeted to me and a million other people, but you were there. But you're still not reaching everyone. And that's something I'll come back to in just a bit. Your ability to provide links with short messages is wonderful. And that fits perfectly into that model of risk communication. Needs to be short. The problem is, though, you get this expectation for quick results. You know, we're in a digital world, and people expect digital speed. Well, not everything moves at that speed. You can engage and answer questions, which is wonderful for engaging with people in your area and your citizens. But trolling's a risk, and you have to kind of deal with trolls and have ways of handling that. And the use of video is pretty amazing in the different ways it can be used in there. But sometimes we have a failure to integrate what's going on in social media within a crisis, and that becomes problematic because it can lead to kind of fracturing of messages in some way.
Okay, I think you gave not only a diplomatic answer, but I think a fairly balanced answer. But am I correct to assume that if I look at the backs and pros and cons of blessing, curses, that social media, operating social media in times of crisis really requires a professional team? Or would you say, don't worry about it, you are now in the situation, you have to embrace new tools?
Ideally, you would have a team, because one of your offshoots, and that's engagement, you want to engage people, you're going to need a team to help deal with that engagement aspect of it. You know, if it's just you doing communication, it's still worthwhile to use, but you'll probably only be using it mostly on sort of the updated information. You won't really kind of able to engage and to answer questions. For that, you really need a team. And teams allow you for better coordination, and also as you start organizing and bringing in other and vetting people, a team is very useful for that. And we've seen that growth. A good illustration of that is in the world of sports. And what we see there is they went from having just one or two people in social media to now, whether you're a college or a professional team, you see a lot of very broad teams. One of my former students was moved into that very early on, is with one of the major teams down in the US, but you have to be part of a team. It really, you know, the bigger your potential audience, the more a team becomes vital to you.
And basically, as a local and regional politician, you are a crisis manager, so you would obviously have to rely on people to do the professional communication. And I would argue that on social media, engagement, communication is far more important than just broadcasting on other channels. So careful what kind of expectation one raises.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Maybe you could give us some examples, good practices of effective use of social media, what you have seen.
Yeah, I think some of the best use of social media has been it's still very strategic. So oftentimes people forget, this happened early on in the US, what I noticed with the practice of communication is like, they said like, oh, social media, we have to be there. And then 2 years later, they're like, oh, why are we here? What are we doing? Then think about the strategy part of it. And you need to have consistency of messages, because you're going to be using multiple platforms and oftentimes multiple people through these platforms. Make sure you work on getting that consistency, as well as providing simple messages with links that are in there. But there have, you know, I'll go back, because you're right. People thought, oh, TikTok, yeah, that's like kids use that, and it's just for like, okay, we're going to have dance competitions and, you know, like do things with songs, but it was a way to find your people when you wanted to address that younger generation who weren't paying attention to the other messaging. TikTok provided an option for that. And that's why I think social media audits are important. You need to understand, what are you using and who is it reaching? And that's not just your numbers of followers, but your types of followers there. And that'll help you see your gaps. And what do you do about those gaps? And that's where I go back to the TikTok example, that they found the gap. The gap was this younger group, that some of the social media they were using were skewing older, and they weren't reaching the younger people they needed to target. So they had to fill in with TikTok, which ordinarily, on an average day, you wouldn't think about using that if you're a local politician, you know, especially if you've happened to see TikTok. And I had my students do some papers about looking at TikTok, and like, yeah, that's not typically what you'd want to see. You know, you're not going to go out there and do the latest dance challenge that's out there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, again, if you can leverage influence, we talked about that already, but make sure that's vetted and controlled to a degree. And just probably the final point up there is something, again, we already touched upon, but be prepared for engagement, because that's what you want. You want engagement. And it's always shocked when like organizations say like, well, why are all these people trying to talk to me? It's like, you invited them to talk to you. So you need to talk to them in some way. So be prepared for the engagement and view that as a very positive aspect. And some companies I've noticed particularly get very upset when they get negative engagement. Well, that's important to know. Why are people negative? It's not always going to be happy, fun messages you get. You need to know where you're failing so you can correct those failures. That becomes critical. So be prepared for engagement and realize that negative information is actually good information. It'll make you better in getting your job and doing and delivering what you need for people in the end.
And maybe also getting some support in a way, because if people make critical or nonsense remarks, sometimes in chats, then people also react and comment, and that can also help to amplify the message. Now, I think there is one bullet point which is very important for all of us. Remember, not everybody is on social media, believe it or not, and that is a strong appeal to all of us to not to forget all the different media channels which we can use. Maybe we could turn to another question. We are now in the middle of a crisis, as I said at the beginning, but let's not forget about what happens when the crisis comes to a close or basically over. As difficult as this might be sometimes to determine when a crisis is really being over, which is also perhaps something you could briefly touch upon. What is a good point in time to decide we move from crisis communication to, how shall I say, regular communication? When can we start posting happy pictures or pictures of happy people and talk about normal things when there are still people suffering the aftermath of COVID? Now, what can we learn actually from the flaws in preparedness and responsiveness in pandemics in this regard? Maybe you can share a couple of ideas and examples with us.
Sure, yeah. Particularly when you get these crises that run for very long periods of time. And we've seen this, so some corporations have suffered this as well over long periods of time, that you kind of have to mix in some of your typical post-crisis communication with your current crisis response. You kind of bring those in together. And I think, especially when you're talking about COVID-19, you need to recognize the people who are making important contributions to this. And again, this is where you praise all the people in your local area who are helping out with this. But we have these new frontline workers, people who work in grocery stores, people who work in food service, people who do deliveries, truck drivers, bank tellers. These are people who are providing valuable service and are in now very stressful jobs because they now know their health is at risk. I have friends in many of these industries, and they post comments about how, like, when I go to work now, it's a different feel because I know we're at risk now. And to kind of recognize these frontline workers. And again, this is part of putting the human face on the crisis. And while this isn't necessarily a happy story, it's a positive story. And have them, this is where you can actually bring in and maybe have some posts from some of these workers telling them about their jobs, what they're doing, what it means to them, and how they see their role in helping the community through this. It's an idea of bringing community members in and having them posting. I know some local groups have done this before with tourism, having local people post about tourism, but have some of these frontline workers who are willing to tell their positive stories about getting through this and how they're trying to help the community.
This would be really the true sense of storytelling.
Yes.
It's very genuine.
Exactly, because you want these people to tell their stories. And this kind of embraces the technical term of transmedia storytelling, and that you have these multiple voices telling multiple stories around the same sort of general theme. And your theme is kind of COVID and how your local group is dealing with it. And this would be part of it. This is definitely the storytelling part of it. And along with that, celebrate the victories. What are the hopes? What are the good statistics? What are some positive things that have happened? Celebrate those, talk about those on the positive side. Mm-hmm. At some point, there will be mourning of the losses. This is part of the healing process. That would be more towards the end when you really felt things were opening and you're starting to restart, and we kind of recognize what has happened along the way. But that's more sort of a long-term down the road type of issue. But the other one is you'll need to start talking about the process of reopening. What is that going to look like for people? If you have a process that you're developing, kind of outline that process, and you can begin sharing with that people as you start to have details, but you won't give them specifics and exact dates. You can just say, this is what we're working towards and what things might look like. It's sort of like the idea of floating a trial balloon, but just kind of give them a little idea that things will be coming ahead. We're seeing that now particularly in sports, particularly in European football, as they talk about how they might return, kind of outlining the process. But also, as you talk about reopening, highlight the actions to increase safety. Because people want to know, like, all right, we're going to reopen and we're going to go back to doing things sort of like we used to, but not exactly, because we can't. There's currently no vaccine, and testing might be limited. So what are you doing to make sure this is safe? Again, just don't say like, we're going to throw open the door, everyone goes outside, I mean, we're back to normal. No, that's not what it's going to be. It's going to be a phased process. Kind of take them through that process and highlight what you're doing now that really should help make them feel safe. And that brings us back to where we started with efficacy, that what you're doing, you have to explain to people why that will work, because they have to believe it'll work if they're really going to buy in and be part of this idea of reopening everything.
And maybe if I could just talk on that, you mentioned a couple of times sports. I was just wondering whether this could not be an idea that, for instance, local politicians partner with local sports clubs, football clubs or so, and that prominent, more or less prominent members, footballers, for instance, or basketballers in the US, could kind of lead by example. It's safe to do this now, or it's not safe to do this. We will return this in this way. To kind of, again, this surrogate effect by using prominent people.
Yes, I think that's a really good idea, because the sports have kind of always been at the front of it. They were the first to close down and the first to recognize it, and they might be the first to come back. They play a very important role in our society. We often forget sports and sports figures are important. And if you want to go back to the idea of hope and feeling better, well, yeah, what better group to tell you, like, yeah, this is what we're doing. We feel safe. We're coming back, and raising people's idea of hope and leading by example.
I was also thinking about that, because I don't know what's your experience. I mean, we touched already a little bit about it. In today's media world, it is so split across age groups, interest groups, etc. In the so-called good old times, you would post it into the newspaper and there was one or two television channels, but today, forget about it. It's a numerous channels.
Yes. Yeah, and that's why, if your example of using the sports figures, it's going to go across all those channels that way, because it'll draw a lot of attention in probably a very positive way.
Very good. Professor Coombs, thanks a million for this. I see that we have a couple of questions here in our chat. If you would mind, I mean, I could just quickly pick some of them, and if you could give us a little bit of your view on that.
Okay.
Elena asking, hello, if local communities that are in an emergency state do not accept the quarantine situation well, what can a regional governor do? Should accept the gravity of the situation, or this would make them feel threatened? Oh, challenging question.
Yeah, and that gets at one of the central problems in crisis communication is sometimes there are communities that don't believe there really is a threat. And you, in that case, you do need to reinforce for them the threat that really does exist. But on top of that, add in that what they're doing puts others at risk. That this is just not themselves, that this is an interconnected world, and that problems will have larger implications. So in that case, you are going to have to focus on the threat aspect of it. Now, that's not pleasant, but sometimes that's the message that needs to be delivered to people.
Linda asked a very concrete question. What's your advice on how to communicate about things that are not related to COVID-19? For example, for an organization that offers different resources and opportunity for its community. Do all the messages need to be connected to COVID-19 and address the current situation, not to seem insensitive? I think that's a very sensitive question, actually, because we are all faced with these hard choices. Can we communicate about something else without mentioning COVID-19?
I think we have to. I think it can't. Not all the messages have to be about COVID-19. I mean, you have to be sensitive. You can't like throw up a message that would be in violation of distancing types of policies. But there are other things going on, and if particularly, let's say an activity that you typically would have done in person that maybe you switch to digital and people can log on and they can meet, that's great. That's actually sort of a way for people to get out of their own sort of limited senses that they're feeling isolated. So I think you still need to deliver the normal messages, as long as they're not counter or harmful in any way to the COVID-19 messages. Not everything has to be about COVID-19. You are still doing other things, other stuff needs to be done, and that's fine to do it.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Being fast forward, let's say 4th of July, COVID still in full height, I hope not. Would you advise the president to still go ahead with normal, regular 4th of July celebrations, National Day celebrations?
No, I think if you're still looking at a danger of spread, you have to go with, you can't do mass gatherings. You know, as much as we all love our mass gatherings, whether they be sports, cultural festivals, going to museums, there has to be limits. We have to do it safely. And if the risk is there, no, not mass. You got to think about, can you have smaller gatherings? What gatherings can be done safely? And if you can't do mass gatherings safely at that point, it would be irresponsible to encourage people to do it. As we're seeing some of that, some groups not believing it and trying to fight back with large gatherings, and that's problematic, because it's oftentimes, for instance, we've had states that thought this isn't that big of a problem. Look, we have a sparse population. They were slow in getting COVID-19, but now they have it and they're becoming a hot spot, and actually maybe more of a threat to the economy than many of the other states that actually went to social distancing sooner.
Reza came in with a question. I work in the civil society field as communications officer. What the sector is facing now is a low opportunity to accomplish their objectives and activities due to measures taken to control the spread of the virus. But their main activity is based on public events, meetings, and face-to-face communication and engagement. Considering the fast and unaccepted change how the whole situation escalated, how civic actors can enhance and improve their way of communicating to the audience.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. If you've been relying upon a lot of in-person, and I understand where they're coming from, a lot of this is about community organizing, getting people together in groups. That's when you really need to think about how you can better utilize the digital channels for this and the digital space for this. You know, what have you done in person that you could now do digitally in some way? And people are getting very creative in doing that. Again, it's not ideal. I mean, yes, you know that that's not the perfect way to reach and to talk with people, but this is kind of the constraints that are forced upon you in this state.
So don't give up, basically, you know?
Yeah, I think you can still push ahead. There are still creative ways of trying to do things. For instance, in the U.S., it's disheartening that, you know, Earth Day is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and all these events are going to be canceled and it won't be the same, but there are still things that you can do.
Andreas from Cyprus is calling in and asking you about in your experience, would you say that local and regional authorities are better in communicating the message with citizens in periods of crisis or big changes rather than central government?
Yes, the local and regional authorities have a better sense of what's going on. They know their people, they know what's happening in their location, and they're better able to respond. You know, when you go up to a higher level, sometimes that's too abstract, and those politicians are really out of touch with what the people really need. And so I think they are, and they usually have also a greater flexibility if you let the local and regional authorities operate and give them the flexibility to do what they need to do.
Okay, good. Somebody anonymous says, as a comms person, how can I try to convince my manager, a politician or high-level official, who may not have much experience of crisis communication, to heed the advice you are giving or to take the comms perspective on board? Welcome to the club. No, I'm kidding.
Show them examples of how other politicians have failed badly at this and what that has meant in terms of not just their careers, which sometimes politicians feel a threat to their careers, but also how it's negatively impacted the communities that they serve. And there are lots of really bad examples, unfortunately, out there of things like that. And those usually are what are going to help you convince them, because it's not like statistics or numbers will work, but it's going back to the storytelling aspect. Tell them a story, and here's the moral of the story. You're at your own peril if you fail to fall in line with crisis communication.
And afterwards, you could probably also demonstrate a positive story to reinforce the argument.
Yeah.
There's someone who wants to ask you, Sandra, we still do have a few minutes, no?
Yes, very few minutes.
Very few. Okay, we will go through that. Do you have a tips for finding the balance between an appropriately serious tone while not being too negative? And maybe also, do you have tips on how to deal with criticism and voices claiming you are not doing enough to help?
Yeah, you have to walk that fine line. I mean, it can't all be negative all the time. And that's when you can, go back to your creativity. What else can you talk about? There might be times where you bring in information like, oh, have you seen there's this link online where you can go and you can visit, say, a museum like the Louvre. Give them some other positive information on the way. Again, it's not directly related to COVID-19, but it's how they cope with the situation. Give them hints on how to cope with the situation. It's a way to kind of balance out the seriousness of the tone. Mm-hmm. The criticisms are always, that's a tough one to deal with. I mean, you have to kind of see, are these legitimate criticisms that you need to address or not? What I recommend this, you don't get in arguments online. If someone has a serious concern that they raise, acknowledge that one and say, okay, here's a way to contact us offline or not in a public space. Maybe it's through email or through phone, and then we can talk more about this, because having public arguments really don't get you very far, because you don't know if that person really is interested in getting a problem addressed or they just want to get attention.
We have to look a little bit at the time. I promise that we will attempt to answer all the questions in the chat so that nobody is left out. Maybe if Sandra permits me 2 final questions. There is one colleague, maybe I can, even under the control of Professor Coombs, answer that. Is it important for the authorities to communicate with their citizens in their mother tongue? I personally would make a passionate plea, yes. But what's your view? I mean, you are living close to the Spanish-speaking border.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your primary messaging is going to come through your mother tongue, but also you need to understand, are there pockets where that won't work? And how do you then reach those pockets? The U.S., probably one of the biggest lessons we had out of Hurricane Katrina was that the messaging was not getting to some communities due to language issues. And again, this is local authorities will know if this is a problem or not, and how you might try to then inject messages into that. But your primary one is going to be through your mother tongue, through your primary language. It just has to be.
Sandra is already looking very strong at me, so I think we have to come to a close. And I hand over to you, Sandra.
Yes, thank you very much. So just for some questions, we will try to answer those in the takeaway document that we will share after the webinar. So don't despair if your question has not been answered. So what I would like our attendees, I would like to ask our attendees to do now is to fill in a survey, actually a poll that will help us understand how we did and how we can improve with our future webinars. I will also, while we give you time to fill in the poll, I will also just once again remind you that we will share the video with you with a takeaway document. And in that email, we will also include a slightly longer evaluation form where you can give also your written feedback. So feel free to give us your suggestions and tell us how you found the webinar.
Thank you so much. For me, I can only express my sincere appreciation to Timothy Coombs, who made time available to talk to us. We're really very grateful for this. It was not only this hour, but also the hours of preparation, etc. We will share also a link to your website. I'm sure people will be interested to learn a little bit more what you are doing, what you have been publishing. As said, Professor Coombs has an extensive publications list and is also editor of a journal. Maybe colleagues find interesting stuff to read there. I tremendously enjoyed it. I hope the up to 100 participants of the seminars did enjoy it as well, learned a little bit. Feel free, please give us feedback. And as said, this is one session and we will definitely continue. Professor Coombs, do you want to?
Thank you for asking me, and I'm glad to share this information. And if people have follow-up and they want to contact me, they should feel free to do so.
Thank you. Give us a hand for Professor Coombs, please, a virtual hand. Thank you.